The rain didn't just fall in the district, it punished. It was a cold, rhythmic drumming against the cracked pavement that seeped through the seams of Lynn Dawson's worn-out sneakers, turning her socks into a sodden, freezing weight. Lynn clutched her oversized hoodie tighter, her fingers trembling so violently she could barely keep her grip on the frayed fabric. Every breath was a conscious effort, a shallow, hitching rattle in a chest that felt perpetually constricted. She was a ghost walking among the living, her pale skin shimmering like wet porcelain under the sickly orange glow of the streetlights. She had been walking for nearly an hour, her body operating on a dwindling reserve of adrenaline and sheer animal terror. Behind her, somewhere in the maze of tenement housing and narrow alleys, was the shadow of Curtis Pickens. She could still feel the phantom heat of his hand against her jaw, a memory that made her stomach roll with a wave of cold nausea. Her face throbbed in time with her heartbeat, a dull, aching reminder of why she was out here in the deluge. She needed to disappear. She needed to be anywhere but under the ceiling they shared, a place that had long ago ceased to be a home and had become a hunting ground. The exhaustion was beginning to win. It started as a heaviness in her knees, then a slow, creeping fog that clouded her thoughts. She had stopped buying real food a month ago to save for a bus ticket she never managed to buy. Now her lack of nutrition was catching up to her. The world began to blur, the neon signs of the local liquor stores bleeding into long, jagged streaks of light. Up ahead, the atmosphere of the street shifted abruptly. The usual clutter of rusted sedans and overflowing trash bins gave way to a line of polished black shadows. A motorcade. 3 armored SUVs sat idling at the curb, their engines emitting a low, predatory hum that vibrated in the soles of Lynn's feet. They looked like creatures from another world, clean, powerful, and utterly indifferent to the misery of the district. They belonged to the kind of power that didn't hide in the shadows, it owned them. Lynn tried to keep her head down, her chestnut hair clinging to her damp neck like a shroud. Don't look at them. Don't let them see you. That was the cardinal rule for survival in this part of the city. But the sidewalk felt like it was tilting beneath her. The edges of her vision began to fray into static, and the weight of her damp clothes felt like lead pulling her toward the concrete. Her heart gave a final, desperate leap against her ribs before the rhythm faltered, skipping a beat that left her gasping. Her knees hit the wet pavement first, the shock of the cold stone barely registering through the haze. She reached out a hand to steady herself, but there was nothing but empty air and the smell of expensive leather and ozone. She didn't hit the ground. A pair of strong, gloved hands caught her by the shoulders, arresting her fall with a firmness that was both terrifying and steadying. Lynn's head fell back, her hazel eyes fluttering open for one final, panicked second. The woman holding her was a vision of lethal elegance. Alexandra looked down at the trembling girl with an expression of detached curiosity that quickly sharpened into something much darker. Alexandra was dressed in a tailored charcoal gray suit that seemed to repel the rain, her ice blue eyes piercing through the gloom with a clarity that made Lynn feel exposed, even in her semi-conscious state. Steady, Alexandra's voice was a low, melodic rasp that cut through the sound of the storm. It wasn't the voice of a savior, it was the voice of a commander. As Lynn slumped forward, losing the battle with consciousness, her oversized sleeve caught on the door handle of the lead vehicle. The fabric hitched up to the elbow. In the harsh, clinical glare of the SUV's LED headlights, the skin of her forearm was revealed. It was a mottled canvas of violet, sickly yellow, and deep, angry crimson, handprints. The distinct, unmistakable marks of a man's grip were burned into her thin arm like a brand. Alexandra's grip tightened. She didn't flinch, but the air around her seemed to drop 10 degrees. Her gaze fixed on the bruises, tracing the shape of the violence inflicted on the girl now dead weight in her arms. Behind her, the door of the second SUV opened, and Julian Vane stepped out, shielding himself with a black umbrella. Julian approached with measured steps, his eyes scanning the perimeter before landing on his employer. He took in the scene, Alexandra, the woman who held the city's underworld in a velvet-gloved fist, kneeling on the wet asphalt of a gutter to cradle a stray. Alexandra, Julian said softly, his voice a professional warning. We're behind schedule. The council is waiting and this sector isn't secure. We should call for a city ambulance and move on. Alexandra didn't look up. She was staring at a particularly dark bruise near Lynn's wrist, her thumb grazing the edge of the injured skin with a terrifying softness. Look at her, Julian, look at these marks. Julian sighed, adjusting his glasses. I see a girl who has had a very bad night. It happens every 10 feet in this neighborhood. It isn't our concern. Street-level domestic disputes are beneath the house of DeLuca. It isn't a dispute, Alexandra snapped, her jawline appearing sharp enough to draw blood. She looked at the bruises not with pity, but with the cold, calculated rage of a predator seeing another's kill on her territory. It's a claim. Someone thinks they can mark what they want and leave it in the street to rot. She shifted her weight, easily hoisting Lynn's limp body into her arms. The girl was so light, so utterly depleted, that she felt like a bundle of dry kindling. They're wrong. No one marks anything in this city without my leave. You can't be serious, Julian murmured, though his posture remained deferential. Taking her with us creates a trail. If she belongs to someone with even a modicum of influence in the district, they'll come looking. It's unnecessary noise when we are trying to consolidate the North. Alexandra turned, her ice blue eyes locking onto his with a predatory intensity that made even the seasoned consigliere go still. Let them come. In fact, I want them to come. I want to see the face of the man who thinks he is big enough to do this. She stepped toward the open door of her lead vehicle, the interior glowing with warm ambient light and the scent of cedar and expensive tobacco. She laid Lynn across the hand-stitched leather seat with a surprising degree of care, though her face remained a mask of cold authority. She didn't see a victim, she saw an affront to her order. The possessive streak that defined Alexandra's soul began to roar to life, triggered by the sight of someone so broken and discarded. Cancel the council meeting, Alexandra ordered, stepping into the car and signaling for the driver to move. And what reason do I give them for the delay? Julian asked, closing the door behind her and speaking through the lowered window. Alexandra looked down at Lynn's sleeping, battered face, her gloved hand resting on the seat beside the girl's chestnut hair. Tell them I found something that belongs to me, and tell the cleaners to find out who she ran from. I want a name, a residential address, and a list of every person he's ever spoken to by dawn. The motorcade pulled away from the curb, its tires hissing against the wet asphalt as it accelerated. Lynn Dawson was no longer a ghost in the district. She was a passenger in the heart of a storm she couldn't yet comprehend. As the city lights blurred past the tinted windows, the world she had known, the world of Curtis Pickens and his whiskey-soaked rage, was already falling away, replaced by a much more elegant and much more lethal kind of danger. Inside the quiet sanctuary of the car, Alexandra watched the girl's shallow breathing. She reached out, her fingers hovering just an inch above the girl's bruised jaw. She didn't know Lynn's name yet, but she knew one thing for certain. The man who had done this had just signed his own death warrant. In Alexandra's world, you didn't just hurt someone, you paid for the privilege. And Curtis Pickens was about to find out he was bankrupt. The transition from the freezing, rain-slicked pavement to the warmth of the penthouse was a journey Lynn Dawson made in the dark, her mind adrift in a sea of gray fog and phantom voices. When consciousness finally began to pull her back to the surface, it didn't come with the usual jolt of adrenaline or the sharp, stinging fear of a heavy footstep outside her bedroom door. Instead, it arrived as a slow, disorienting realization of weightlessness. For the first time in years, her body didn't ache from the hard press of a thin mattress against a cold floor. She felt as though she were floating, submerged in a softness so profound it felt like a trap. Lynn opened her eyes, and the sheer scale of the room made her breath hitch. The ceiling was impossibly high, crisscrossed with recessed lights that cast a soft, amber glow over walls the color of smoke. To her left, a floor-to-ceiling window revealed the city skyline, a glittering carpet of diamonds and obsidian that stretched toward the horizon. From this height, the district, the place where she had bled and scavenged, was nothing more than a distant, flickering blur. She was in the clouds, or perhaps she was dead. She tried to sit up, but the movement sent a sharp spike of protest through her ribs. A soft groan escaped her lips, and the sound seemed to echo forever in the vast, open space. That was the first thing that truly terrified her, the silence. In the basement apartment with Curtis, there was never silence. There was the constant hum of the refrigerator, the shouting of neighbors through paper-thin walls, the clinking of glass, and the heavy, rhythmic thud of his boots. Silence was a luxury she had never owned, and here it felt heavy, pressing against her eardrums like the weight of the ocean. It was a predatory silence, the kind that preceded a strike. "You're awake," a voice said, cutting through the stillness like a blade. Lynn flinched, pulling the silk sheets up to her chin as she scanned the room. Alexandra was standing near the window, a silhouette of sharp angles against the city lights. She had traded the rain-soaked suit for a deep emerald silk blouse, the sleeves rolled up to reveal forearms that looked like they were carved from marble. She held a crystal glass of amber liquid, the ice clinking softly, a sound that made Lynn's heart hammer against her ribs. Where am I? Lynn's voice was a fragile thread, barely audible. In a place where he can't find you, Alexandra replied, stepping into the light. Her ice blue eyes were unreadable, but they didn't leave Lynn's face. She moved with a feline grace that suggested she was never truly at rest, even in her own home. My physician has seen to your immediate needs. You were dehydrated, malnourished, and suffering from a mild concussion, not to mention the older fractures that were never allowed to heal properly. Lynn looked down at her hands. They were clean, the grime of the diner and the city scrubbed away, but the bruises on her wrists stood out even more vividly against the white sheets. She felt a sudden, frantic urge to hide them, to pull her sleeves down, but she was wearing a soft, expensive-looking nightshirt that wasn't hers. The realization that she had been touched, changed, and moved while unconscious made her skin crawl with a familiar, defensive itch. I have to go, Lynn whispered, her hazel eyes darting toward the door. If he finds out I'm here, if he thinks I ran away to a place like this. He won't find out, Alexandra said, her voice dropping an octave. She walked toward the edge of the bed, stopping just far enough away to keep Lynn from bolting. And if he did, he wouldn't survive the walk across the lobby. You are under my protection now, Lynn Dawson. Use of her full name felt like a brand. Lynn looked at the woman, the mafia boss whose name was whispered in the district like a curse, and felt a new kind of vertigo. This wasn't the safety she had dreamed of when she stared at travel brochures in the library. This was a gilded cage. The marble floors, the original oil paintings, and the scent of expensive lilies were just bars made of gold. Curtis's violence was loud, predictable, and ugly. Alexandra's power was quiet, infinite, and beautiful. Why? Lynn asked, her voice trembling. You don't know me, you found me in the street. People like you don't just help. Alexandra set her glass down on a mahogany side table and leaned forward, her sharp jawline catching the light. I don't help, Lynn, I collect. And I find that I have a profound distaste for things that are broken by clumsy hands. You were discarded in the rain like trash by a man who isn't fit to shine my shoes. That is an insult to the order I keep in this city. She reached out, and for a terrifying moment, Lynn thought she was going to strike her. Instead, Alexandra's fingers hovered near Lynn's temple, tucking a stray lock of chestnut hair behind her ear. The contact was electric, not the burning heat of a blow, but a cool, possessive touch that sent shivers down Lynn's spine. The silence here scares you, Alexandra observed, her eyes narrowing as she read the pulse jumping in Lynn's neck. You're waiting for the screaming to start, you're waiting for the first hit. I'm not used to it, Lynn admitted, her eyes filling with unwanted tears. Get used to it, Alexandra commanded. In this house, the only voice that matters is mine, and I do not scream, I don't have to. She stood up, restoring the distance between them, but the weight of her presence remained. She gestured toward a small control panel on the wall. The kitchen is stocked. There are clothes in the dressing room that will actually fit you. Stay in the bed. If you try to leave the suite, my security will stop you. Not because you are a prisoner, but because the world outside is still looking for you, and I haven't finished deciding what to do with the man who left those marks on your arms. Lynn watched her walk toward the door, the emerald silk of her shirt shimmering. As the heavy oak door clicked shut, the silence rushed back in, filling the cavernous room. Lynn sank back into the pillows, her mind racing. She was safe from Curtis, yes. The locks on these doors were stronger than any he could break. But as she looked around at the luxury that cost more than her entire life was worth, she realized the price of this safety might be something she wasn't ready to pay. Alexandra hadn't looked at her with pity. She had looked at her like a prized acquisition, a rare bird with broken wings that she intended to keep in a cage of glass and steel. Lynn closed her eyes, trying to find the strength to be grateful, but all she could hear was the terrifying, absolute silence of the penthouse. A silence that promised that when the violence finally came, it would be surgical, total, and permanent. Outside, the city continued to burn and bleed, but inside the gilded cage, the air was still. Lynn Dawson lay in the heart of the storm, realizing that while she had escaped the devil she knew, she had fallen directly into the lap of a god who didn't know the meaning of mercy. The morning light did not dare to be harsh in Alexandra's sanctuary. It filtered through the expansive windows as a muted, clinical gray, illuminating the dust motes dancing in the silence of the suite. Lynn sat on the edge of the sprawling bed, her legs dangling over the side, feeling dangerously small. The nightshirt she had been given was made of a silk so fine it felt like a second skin, yet it offered no warmth against the chill of the woman standing in the corner of the room. Alexandra remained in the shadows, leaning against a mahogany wardrobe, her arms crossed over her chest. She hadn't said a word since the doctor arrived, but her presence was a physical weight, a tether that kept Lynn from drifting away into another panic attack. The doctor, a man named Dr. Eris with steady hands and a face that had clearly seen the aftermath of the city's darkest sins, moved with a quiet efficiency. He didn't ask questions about who had caused the injuries, he simply documented them with the cold precision of an appraiser. "I need to check the ribs again, Miss Dawson," the doctor said softly. "The bruising suggests a heavy impact, possibly a kick." Lynn felt a phantom pain flare in her side, the memory of Curtis's heavy work boot connecting with her torso while she lay curled on the kitchen linoleum. She glanced toward the shadows, her hazel eyes searching for Alexandra's. The Mafia Boss didn't move, but the light caught the ice blue of her irises, which seemed to have deepened into a bruised violet. "Go on," Alexandra's voice came from the darkness, a low, dangerous vibration. "Show him everything." Lynn reached for the hem of the silk shirt, her fingers fumbling with the delicate fabric. As she pulled it up, exposing her torso, the silence in the room seemed to solidify into something jagged. Under the bright, focused beam of the doctor's penlight, the full extent of the damage was laid bare. It wasn't just the fresh, angry purple of the handprints on her arms. Her ribs were a mosaic of old and new trauma, faded yellow patches overlapping with deep, blackened hematomas. On her shoulder there was a jagged, silver-white scar from a broken plate, and across her hip, the faint, ropey lines of a belt. The doctor's intake of breath was sharp, but it was nothing compared to the shift in the room's atmosphere. Alexandra stepped out of the shadows. Her movement was slow, deliberate, and terrifying. She approached the bed until she was standing directly over the doctor, looking down at Lynn's bared skin. As each mark was revealed, Alexandra's jaw tightened until the muscles in her neck stood out like cords. She didn't look at Lynn with the soft, watery eyes of a social worker. She looked at the wounds like a general inspecting the wreckage of a scorched earth campaign. "This one," Alexandra said, her voice barely a whisper as she pointed to a circular scar on Lynn's collarbone. "What caused this?" Lynn swallowed hard, her throat feeling like it was full of glass. A cigarette. He was angry because I forgot to buy his brand. He said he needed to make sure I remembered next time." The doctor's pen scratched against his clipboard, the sound unnervingly loud. Alexandra didn't blink. Her ice blue eyes were fixed on the scar, and for a moment, Lynn saw a flash of something primal and unhinged behind that polished, aristocratic exterior. It was the look of a woman who was mentally calculating the exact amount of blood required to balance the scales. "In the ribs?" Alexandra asked, her tone deceptively calm. "A week ago," Lynn whispered, her head drooping, "I tripped. I told the people at the diner I tripped." "You didn't trip," Alexandra countered, her voice dropping to a growl. She reached out, her gloved hand hovering just above the deepest bruise on Lynn's side. She didn't touch it, perhaps knowing that even her lightest graze would cause pain, but the heat radiating from her palm was palpable. "A trip doesn't leave the shape of a heel in your flesh. He did this while you were down, didn't he? He stood over you and he broke you because it made him feel like a king." Lynn couldn't answer. She only nodded, the tears she had been holding back finally spilling over and tracing hot paths through the clinical antiseptic the doctor had used to clean her skin. She felt a deep, soul-crushing shame at having her secrets cataloged like this, at having the evidence of her weakness displayed for a woman who seemed to know nothing of it. "He's a small man," Alexandra said, finally looking Lynn in the eye. The coldness was gone, replaced by a dark, simmering heat. "Only small men need to break things to prove they exist. He thinks he owns the map of your body because he's the one who drew the lines. He's wrong." The doctor cleared his throat, sensing the escalating tension. "She needs rest and a strict regimen of anti-inflammatories. I've bandaged the worst of the lacerations, but the internal healing will take time. She's severely underweight, Alexandra. Her body is trying to heal on an empty tank." "Provide a list of everything she needs," Alexandra commanded, not taking her eyes off Lynn. "The best of everything. If she so much as winces, I want to know why." As the doctor packed his bag and retreated toward the door, sensing the silent dismissal, Alexandra sat on the edge of the bed. The weight of her presence shifted the mattress, drawing Lynn toward her. The silence returned, but it wasn't the terrifying silence of the night before. It was a heavy, expectant quiet, like the air before a lightning strike. "You're afraid of me," Alexandra noted, her voice softer now, almost a caress. "I'm afraid of everything," Lynn admitted, clutching the silk shirt back to her chest. Alexandra reached out, and this time she didn't hesitate. She took Lynn's chin in her hand, forcing her to look up. The ice in Alexandra's eyes had turned to fire, a dark, possessive flame that promised a violence far greater than anything Curtis Pickens could ever conceive. "Good," Alexandra whispered. "Fear will keep you sharp. But understand this, Lynn, you are no longer a victim of the district. You are a ward of the House of DeLuca. The man who gave you these marks thinks he is a predator. He is about to learn that in this city there is only one top of the food chain, and he has been hunting in my woods." She stood up, her silhouette tall and imposing against the gray morning light. The inspection was over, but the war had clearly just begun. As Alexandra walked toward the door, her stride was that of a woman who had already decided how the story would end. Lynn sat in the middle of the vast, expensive bed, shivering despite the warmth of the room, realizing that while her wounds were being tended to, she had merely traded a small, petty tormentor for a magnificent, world-shaking one. The bruises on her skin felt like they were glowing, marks of a past life that Alexandra was clearly intent on erasing with blood. Lynn looked out at the city, wondering if Curtis was already feeling the first cold breath of the storm that was coming for him. She hoped he was, and for the first time since the rain began, she didn't feel like she was going to faint. She felt the first, tiny spark of a cold, borrowed strength. The neon sign for the Greasy Spoon Diner flickered with a rhythmic, dying buzz, casting a sickly pink glow over the rain-slicked sidewalk. Inside, the air smelled of stale coffee, burnt grease, and the low-level anxiety that usually preceded a storm. Curtis Pickens sat in a corner booth, his burly frame spilling over the cracked vinyl. His leather jacket, cracked and smelling of wet hide and cheap whiskey, creaked as he shifted his weight. His knuckles were raw, the scabs from 2 nights ago still jagged and dark, and his eyes, bloodshot and restless, scanned the back of the diner every time the swinging kitchen doors groaned. He was looking for Lynn. He had spent the last 36 hours in a state of escalating, twitchy rage. She hadn't come home. She hadn't been at the bus station. She hadn't been in the hospitals. The lack of her presence was like a phantom limb. He felt he was missing the only thing in the world that gave him a sense of scale. Without someone to cower beneath him, Curtis felt small, and feeling small was a sensation he corrected with violence. He needed that familiar weight of her fear to ground him, to remind him that even if the rest of the world ignored him, he was a king in one small, terrified room. He slammed a heavy hand onto the table, making the half-empty sugar shaker rattle and the laminated menus slide toward the edge. "Hey!" he barked at the waitress, a tired woman named Martha who had seen too many men like him pass through these doors. "I asked you 3 times, lady. Where is she?" "Lynn Dawson. I know she works the late shift. I know she needs the money. Don't play games with me." Martha didn't look up from the counter she was wiping. She had developed a thick skin over 20 years of serving the district's dregs, but even she couldn't hide the slight tremor in her hands. She called out Curtis, sick. Said she caught a bug in the rain, now buy a coffee or get out. You're scaring the other 3 customers I have left, and I'm not losing my tips because you're having a bad night. Curtis sneered, his lip curling to reveal yellowed teeth. He stood up slowly, the chair screeching against the tile like a dying animal. He moved toward the counter, his posture aggressive, his chest puffed out to intimidate. "She's not sick, she's hiding. She thinks she can just vanish after everything I've done for her. And when I find her, and I will find her, I'm gonna make sure she actually has a reason to stay in bed for a month. You tell her that, you tell her I'm looking." The bell above the door chimed, a light, delicate sound that seemed entirely out of place in the grimy, heavy interior of the diner. It was a sound that belonged in a jewelry store or a high-end boutique, not in a place that served lukewarm gravy and broken dreams. Curtis didn't turn around at first. He was too busy enjoying the way Martha's eyes suddenly widened and her hands stopped moving entirely. He thought she was finally realizing the depth of his threat. He thought she was finally afraid of him. It wasn't until he felt the sudden, unnatural chill in the room that he realized the air had changed. The smell of grease and old mop water was suddenly cut by the sharp, clean scent of expensive cedar, rain-damp wool, and something metallic, like the edge of a fresh blade. "Mr. Pickens, I presume." The voice was thin, precise, and entirely devoid of emotion. It was the kind of voice that made you think of ice cracking underfoot. Curtis spun around, his hand instinctively balling into a fist, his brow furrowed in a defensive snarl. Standing by the door was a man who looked like he had been dropped in from another dimension. Julian Vane stood perfectly still, his slim frame draped in a coat of midnight wool that cost more than Curtis made in a decade of petty theft. He adjusted his silver-rimmed glasses with a single manicured finger, his eyes behind the lenses cool and analytical. He wasn't looking at Curtis as a threat. He was looking at him as a minor inconvenience, like a smudge on a window pane. "Who the hell are you?" Curtis spat, stepping away from the counter to give himself room to swing. He tried to reclaim his dominance, looming over the smaller, slighter man. "This is private business, pal. Get lost before I break those fancy glasses of yours and feed 'em to you." Julian didn't flinch, he didn't even blink. He simply reached into his inner pocket and pulled out a small, heavy envelope of cream-colored cardstock. The paper was thick, embossed with a seal that Curtis didn't recognize but instinctively feared. "My name is of no consequence to you, Mr. Pickens," Julian said, his tone as flat as a dial tone. "However, my employer has taken a sudden and vested interest in your well-being, or rather the lack thereof. It is a rare thing for her to notice someone of your stature. You should consider yourself quite unique in that regard." Curtis let out a harsh, jagged laugh, though it sounded hollow even to his own ears. "Your employer? What, did Lynn find herself a lawyer? That's rich. She can't afford a candy bar, let alone some suit. Tell whoever sent you that she's my property. She comes home when I say she comes home, and no piece of paper is gonna change that." Julian's expression didn't change, but a shadow seemed to pass over his features. A flicker of the lethal, silent machinery that operated beneath his polished exterior. He stepped forward, entering Curtis's personal space with a lack of fear that was deeply unsettling. "The word property is a dangerous one to use in this city, Mr. Pickens. It implies ownership. And in this city, there is only one individual who truly owns the ground you stand on. You have accidentally encroached upon a very private garden." Julian reached out and placed the envelope against Curtis's chest. He didn't shove it. He simply held it there with enough pressure that Curtis was forced to take it just to keep it from falling. The weight of the paper felt immense, like it was filled with lead. "Inside that envelope is a list," Julian whispered, leaning in so close that Curtis could see the reflection of his own panicked face in Julian's lenses. "It is a list of every alleyway you've slept in, every woman you've ever laid a hand on, and the exact location of the Social Security office where you pick up your checks. It also contains a one-way ticket out of this jurisdiction. It is a gift, a rare act of mercy from a woman who does not believe in the concept." Curtis's breath was coming in ragged hitches now. The smell of Julian's expensive cologne was making him dizzy. "You can't do this. I haven't done anything to you. I don't even know who you are." "You existed," Julian replied simply. "And you did so in a way that offended a woman who does not tolerate offense. She saw the marks you left on Miss Dawson. She saw the cigarette burn. She saw the rib. To you, those are trophies of your power. To her, they are evidence of a creature that needs to be removed from the ecosystem. If you are still in this city by sunset tomorrow, you will not be arrested. You will not be given a trial. You will simply cease to be a part of the census." Julian turned on his heel, his movements as fluid and efficient as a clockwork mechanism. He stopped at the door, glancing back at the trembling man who was now clutching the envelope as if it were a shield. "One more thing, Mr. Pickens. The name Lynn Dawson is no longer a name you are permitted to speak. If it so much as crosses your lips in a whisper, I will hear of it. And you will find that the silence of the DeLuca family is very, very permanent." The bell chimed again as Julian stepped out into the rain. Curtis stood frozen in the center of the diner, the heavy cream-colored envelope clutched in his scarred hand. He looked toward the kitchen doors where he had expected to find a girl to break, and realized for the first time that the world had grown much larger and much colder than he ever imagined. He looked at Martha, who was now staring at him with a pity that burned worse than any insult. He was no longer the hunter. He was a man with a deadline, standing in the shadow of a lioness who had finally decided to clear her throat. Penthouse was a cathedral of glass and shadow, a place where the air always felt expensive and slightly thin. Lynn sat at the end of a long obsidian dining table that seemed to stretch for miles, her hands folded neatly in her lap to hide the tremor that wouldn't quit. The lighting was low, provided by minimalist fixtures that cast long, sharp silhouettes against the marble floor. In front of her sat a plate of delicate sea bass and roasted vegetables, food that looked more like art than sustenance. It was a far cry from the lukewarm cans of soup she used to eat over a cracked sink, yet she couldn't bring herself to pick up the silver fork. Across from her sat Alexandra, the woman who had plucked her from the gutter and placed her in a palace. For a long time, the only sound was the rhythmic, soft click of Alexandra's knife against her plate. She moved with a terrifying grace, even when performing a task as mundane as eating. She hadn't changed into anything casual. She still wore a structured silk blouse, the top button undone, her ice blue eyes reflecting the city lights through the massive windows. She looked like a predator that had temporarily satiated its hunger but remained coiled, ready to strike at the slightest vibration in the air. "The food is getting cold, Lynn," Alexandra said, her voice a low, smooth rasp that echoed in the vastness of the room. She didn't look up, but Lynn felt the weight of her attention like a physical pressure. My chef does not appreciate his work being ignored. Neither do I. Lynn flinched, her fingers twitching. She picked up the fork, her knuckles white. I'm sorry, I'm not very hungry. You haven't eaten a full meal in weeks, Alexandra noted, finally setting her cutlery down and leaning back. She fixed Lynn with a gaze that was uncomfortably perceptive. Your body is in a state of starvation, yet your mind is telling you that you don't deserve the fuel. Is that what he told you? That you should be grateful for the scraps he left? Lynn swallowed hard, the mention of Curtis making her skin crawl. He liked things a certain way. If I spent too much on groceries, he'd say I was being greedy, that I was taking from him. Alexandra's jaw tightened, a small muscle leaping in her cheek. He was a thief then, not just of your safety, but of your basic humanity. She took a slow sip of wine, her eyes never leaving Lynn's face. You think I'm being nice to you, don't you? Bringing you here, giving you a doctor, feeding you this meal, you think this is an act of kindness. Lynn looked up, her doe-like hazel eyes filled with a mixture of gratitude and confusion. Isn't it? You didn't have to help me, you could have left me in the rain. Alexandra let out a short, dark laugh that lacked any hint of mirth. She stood up and walked the length of the table, her steps silent on the polished stone. She stopped behind Lynn's chair, leaning down until her lips were inches from Lynn's ear. The scent of cedar and a faint, metallic tang followed her. I am not nice, Lynn, Alexandra whispered, her voice vibrating with a hidden intensity. Kindness is for people who believe the world can be soft. I know better. What you are feeling for me isn't kindness, it's possession. She reached out, her gloved hand resting on the back of Lynn's chair, her fingers dangerously close to the girl's chestnut hair. I didn't bring you here because I felt sorry for you. I brought you here because I saw something that belonged to the world of the broken, and I decided it belonged to me instead. There is a difference. Lynn felt a new kind of fear bloom in her chest, not the frantic, jagged fear she felt with Curtis, but a deep, heavy dread that made her bones feel like lead. Curtis was a fire, wild, destructive, and messy. Alexandra was a glacier, ancient, unstoppable, and cold enough to burn. I don't understand, Lynn whispered, her voice trembling. It's simple, Alexandra said, moving to stand beside Lynn. She took Lynn's chin in her hand, her grip firm but not painful, forcing the girl to look at her. Curtis Pickens wanted to break you so he could feel tall. He wanted you to be small so he didn't have to look up. I, however, want you whole. I want you strong, not because I care about your happiness, but because anything that carries my name must be formidable. You are under my shadow now. That means your pain is my insult. Your bruises are my failure, and I do not fail. The intensity in Alexandra's ice-blue eyes was overwhelming. Lynn realized then that her protection came with a price that might be even higher than the one she had paid in the district. Curtis wanted her body. Alexandra wanted her soul, her loyalty, and her very existence to revolve around the power of the DeLuca Empire. It was a different kind of cage, one lined with silk and guarded by wolves, but a cage nonetheless. You're scaring me, Lynn admitted, her voice breaking. Good, Alexandra replied, a ghost of a smile touching her lips, a cold, sharp thing. Fear of the right things will keep you alive. You've spent your life being afraid of a man who could barely tie his own shoes without a bottle of whiskey. Now you're in the presence of real power. It should be unsettling. Alexandra straightened up, her shadow stretching across the table like a dark wing. She gestured toward the plate of food. Now eat. Every bite you take is a strike against the man who tried to starve you. Every pound you gain is a fortification against the world that tried to crush you. I am building a fortress around you, Lynn Dawson. You can either live within the walls and be safe, or you can step outside and be torn apart. The choice, as always, is yours. But know that once you accept my bread, you accept my rules. Lynn looked down at the sea bass, the steam rising in delicate swirls. She felt the weight of the penthouse, the weight of the city, and the weight of the woman standing over her. She picked up the fork and took a small, hesitant bite. It tasted like nothing she had ever had, rich, complex, and overwhelming. As she chewed, she watched Alexandra walk back to her own seat. The Mafia Boss didn't say another word, but the silence between them was no longer empty. It was filled with an unspoken contract, a bond forged in the shadow of a violent protectiveness that was more terrifying than any blow. Lynn realized that she hadn't just been saved, she had been claimed. And as she looked out at the rain hitting the reinforced glass of the windows, she wondered if she would ever be allowed to be her own person again, or if she was destined to spend the rest of her life as a precious, protected thing in Alexandra's lethal collection. The fear didn't leave her, but it changed shape. It became a steady, cold companion, a reminder that in the world of the DeLuca, safety wasn't a right, it was a privilege granted by the Queen. And Lynn Dawson was learning, one bite at a time, just how much that privilege was going to cost her. The transition from the quiet luxury of the penthouse to the armored interior of the DeLuca transport felt like a descent back into a world of cold metal and violent intent. Lynn sat pressed into the deep leather of the rear seat, her fingers knotting together so tightly the skin turned white over her knuckles. She was dressed in a suit of dark silk that Alexandra had chosen for her, a garment that felt less like clothing and more like a uniform of the house. Beside her, Alexandra sat in a state of relaxed lethality, her eyes fixed on a tablet, her sharp jawline illuminated by the blue glow of the screen. They were moving through the neutral zone of the city, a strip of no man's land between the high-rises and the industrial sprawl, heading toward a gala that was supposed to solidify a new trade agreement. But the air felt heavy, saturated with the same static that preceded a lightning strike. Lynn looked out the tinted, bulletproof window, watching the rain smear the neon lights of the city into long, jagged streaks of red and amber. For the first time in days, the silence didn't feel like a sanctuary, it felt like a countdown. "You're holding your breath again," Alexandra said, not looking up from her screen. Her voice was a low, steady anchor in the dark. "The car is reinforced against high-caliber rounds. My men are in the vehicles ahead and behind us. You are safer in this seat than you have been in your entire life." "I know," Lynn whispered, though her heart was drumming a frantic, irregular rhythm against her ribs. I feel like he's close. It's a feeling I get, like the air is getting thinner." Alexandra finally looked up, her ice blue eyes narrowing as she studied Lynn's face. "Curtis Pickens is a coward who was given an ultimatum. He is likely halfway to another state by now, nursing his wounded pride with a bottle of cheap gin." "He doesn't have pride," Lynn countered, her voice trembling. "He has an obsession. He doesn't think I'm a person. He thinks I'm a part of him that ran away. He won't stop until he cuts me back out." The words had barely left her lips when the world exploded in a roar of grinding metal and shattering glass. A heavy-duty tow truck, its lights darkened and its front end reinforced with a steel plow, slammed into the lead SUV of the motorcade. The impact sent the first vehicle spinning across the wet asphalt, a fountain of sparks erupting into the rainy night. Lynn's scream was swallowed by the sudden, violent lurch of their own car as the driver slammed on the brakes, the tires screaming in a desperate battle for traction. Before the transport could stabilize, a black van swerved from a side alley, pinning them against the concrete barrier of the overpass. "Stay down," Alexandra commanded. Her voice wasn't panicked, it was a whip crack of authority. She reached into the side panel of the door, pulling out a sleek, matte black handgun with a practiced fluidity that made Lynn's blood run cold. Outside, the rain was illuminated by the flickering strobes of muzzle flashes. Men in tactical gear emerged from the van, but among them was a figure that didn't fit. A man in a stained leather jacket, his face twisted into a mask of manic, desperate rage. Curtis Pickens was there, clutching a sawed-off shotgun, his eyes wide and unfocused. He wasn't moving like a soldier. He was moving like a man possessed, backed by the professional gunmen of the Morty family, Alexandra's fiercest rivals. "Lynn," Curtis roared, his voice audible even through the reinforced glass. The sound of her name on his tongue made Lynn's stomach turn to ice. "I know you're in there, you little bitch. You think you can hide with these suits? You think you can just leave me?" He fired a round at the window, the buckshot spiderwebbing the outer layer of the glass but failing to penetrate. The impact sounded like a sledgehammer hitting an anvil. Lynn curled into a ball on the floorboards, her hands over her ears, the familiar, suffocating terror of the district rushing back to drown her. Alexandra watched the glass with a terrifying, detached calm. She didn't look at Curtis as a man, she looked at him as a technical error that needed to be deleted. She pressed a button on the armrest, her voice steady as she spoke into the comms. "Julian, the Mortys have decided to break the ceasefire using the stray as a pretext. Clear the perimeter. Leave the one in the leather jacket for me." "Understood, boss," Julian's voice crackled back, sounding as bored as if he were discussing a lunch menu. The counterattack was surgical. Alexandra's security team descended from the third vehicle, their fire disciplined and devastating. The professional mercenaries backed by the Mortys began to fall back. realizing they had underestimated the speed of the DeLuca response. But Curtis didn't fall back. He was beyond reason, fueled by a cocktail of whiskey and the false bravado given to him by his new friends. He threw himself against the door of the car, his face pressed against the spider-webbed glass. His eyes found Lynn's, and for a terrifying second, the gilded cage of the penthouse felt 1,000 miles away. "I'm taking you back, Lynn. I'll kill you before I let them keep you." Alexandra gripped the handle of the door, her ice-blue eyes burning with a dark, predatory fire. She looked down at Lynn, who was shivering on the floor. "Look at me, Lynn." Lynn looked up, her face pale, her doe-like hazel eyes wide with a mixture of horror and awe. "This is the world you live in now," Alexandra said, her voice dropping to a low, lethal whisper. "Men like him think they can reach into my life and take what they want. They think because I haven't killed them yet I am soft. I am going to show him why the silence of this house is something to be feared." Alexandra kicked the door open. The force of the armored door hitting Curtis sent him reeling back onto the wet pavement. Alexandra stepped out into the rain, the emerald silk of her blouse immediately darkening, her silhouette sharp and regal against the chaos of the gunfight. She didn't crouch, she didn't hide. She walked toward Curtis with the slow, inevitable stride of a reaper. Curtis scrambled to his feet, trying to level his shotgun, but he was slow, his movements hampered by fear and the weight of his own failures. Alexandra didn't give him the chance. She fired 3 shots in rapid succession. The first hit the shotgun, spinning it out of his hands. The second and third hit the pavement at his feet, the ricochet spraying him with stone and water. "You," Alexandra said, her voice carrying over the rain like a death sentence. "You are the one who marks what isn't his." Curtis fell to his knees, his bravado finally shattering. He looked around at the bodies of the mercenaries who had abandoned him, realizing that he was a small, petty man who had wandered into a war between gods. "Please," Curtis whimpered, the sound pathetic against the roar of the city. "She's my wife, she belongs to me." Alexandra stood over him, the barrel of her gun resting against his forehead. The rain washed the blood from her knuckles, and for a moment she looked like a statue of vengeance carved from ice. "Nothing belongs to you anymore, not even the air in your lungs." She looked back at the car where Lynn was watching through the open door, her face a mask of shock. Alexandra didn't pull the trigger, not yet. She wanted Lynn to see. She wanted her to understand that the protection of the DeLuca was a violent, absolute thing. "Julian," Alexandra called out, not taking her eyes off the trembling man at her feet. "Clean this up, take him to the warehouse. I want him to understand exactly whose property he tried to steal before he dies." As the security team swarmed the area, Alexandra stepped back into the car, her movements calm and precise. She sat down beside Lynn, her damp clothes smelling of rain and gunpowder. She reached out, her hand resting on Lynn's shaking shoulder. "He won't touch you again," Alexandra said, her voice returning to that smooth, possessive rasp. "But remember this moment, Lynn, this is the price of the silence. This is the cost of the penthouse. You aren't a victim anymore. You are a reason for a war." The transport pulled away, leaving the wreckage behind. Lynn sat in the dark, watching the city lights flicker past, realizing that while the breach had been closed, the world had changed forever. She wasn't just safe, she was dangerous. And as she looked at Alexandra's calm, lethal profile, she realized that the most terrifying thing wasn't that Curtis had found her. It was that she no longer wanted to run away from the woman who had saved her. The warehouse on the edge of the shipping yards felt like the end of the world. It was a cavernous, hollow ribcage of rusted steel and rotted timber, where the smell of salt water and diesel fuel hung thick in the stagnant air. Lynn stood in the center of a small circle of light provided by a single flickering industrial bulb, her breathing shallow and ragged. Alexandra stood a few feet away, her silhouette a sharp, jagged line against the darkness. They were waiting. They were waiting for the inevitable conclusion to a war that had started on a rainy sidewalk days ago. The heavy iron doors at the far end of the warehouse groaned open, and 2 of Alexandra's men dragged a broken, struggling figure into the light. Curtis Pickens looked like a ghost of the man who had haunted Lynn's nightmares. His leather jacket was torn, his face was a map of bruises and dried blood, and his eyes were wide with the frantic, unhinged terror of a trapped animal. But as soon as his gaze landed on Lynn, the fear in his eyes was momentarily eclipsed by a flicker of that old, toxic possessiveness. He didn't see the armed men or the woman who held his life in her hands. He saw the girl he had spent years breaking, and he saw her standing tall in a world he couldn't touch. "Lynn," he wheezed, his voice a wet, rattling sound. "Lynn, tell them you're mine. Tell them to let me go and we can go home. I'll forgive you, baby. I'll forget all of this." Lynn felt the coldness of the warehouse floor seep into her bones. She didn't move. She didn't speak. She just watched him with her hazel eyes, which were no longer filled with the frantic desperation of a victim, but with a hollow, echoing exhaustion. Alexandra stepped forward, her ice blue eyes fixed on Curtis with a detached, clinical hatred. "He still speaks to you as if you are a dog that wandered off its leash," Alexandra said, her voice a low, vibrating hum. "He still thinks he has a claim on the air you breathe." "She's my wife," Curtis roared, a sudden, desperate burst of adrenaline allowing him to wrench his arm free from one of the guards. In a movement so fast it blurred the edges of the light, Curtis lunged. He didn't go for the guards and he didn't go for Alexandra. He went for the one thing he felt he still had a right to destroy. He reached out and grabbed Lynn by the hair, his thick, scarred fingers twisting into her chestnut locks with a savage, familiar violence. He jerked her head back, exposing her throat, his face hovering inches from hers, his breath smelling of copper and fear. "You're coming with me," he hissed, the sawed-off shotgun he had hidden in the waistband of his trousers pressed against her side. "If I can't have you, nobody gets to keep you. You're mine, Lynn, you're mine until you die." The silence that followed was absolute. It was a silence that didn't just exist in the room, it seemed to swallow the entire city. Lynn looked at Alexandra. For the first time since they had met, the polished, aristocratic mask of the Mafia Boss was gone. The cold, calculated authority that defined the House of DeLuca didn't just crack, it shattered. Alexandra's ice blue eyes didn't just darken, they turned into twin voids of predatory, unadulterated rage. The boss was gone, replaced by something much older and much more terrifying. It was a primal, visceral loss of control, the kind of rage that didn't scream but burned with the heat of a dying star. Alexandra didn't call for her men, she didn't use her gun. She moved with a speed that defied the laws of physics, a streak of emerald silk and lethal intent. She was on Curtis before he could even pull the trigger. Her hand shot out, her fingers closing around Curtis's wrist with a sickening crunch of bone that echoed through the warehouse like a gunshot. Curtis screamed, the shotgun falling from his nerveless fingers as Alexandra twisted his arm behind his back with a strength that seemed impossible for her frame. But she wasn't done. She grabbed him by the throat, her gloved fingers sinking into the flesh of his neck, and slammed him against one of the rusted steel pillars. The impact was so violent that the entire structure seemed to shudder. "You touched her," Alexandra whispered. The voice didn't sound like Alexandra's anymore. It was a guttural, terrifying sound stripped of all humanity. "You put your filthy, broken hands on her again." She struck him. It wasn't the disciplined strike of a soldier. It was the raw, unrestrained fury of a monster. Each blow was a testament to the days of watching Lynn shiver in her sleep, a testament to every bruise she had documented on that pale skin. She hit him until his face was unrecognizable, until his pleas for mercy turned into a wet, gurgling silence. She struck him. It wasn't the disciplined strike of a soldier. It was the raw, unrestrained fury of a monster. Each blow was a testament to the days of watching Lynn shiver in her sleep, a testament to every bruise she had documented on that pale skin. She hit him until his face was unrecognizable, until his pleas for mercy turned into a wet, gurgling silence. Lynn watched, paralyzed. She had seen Curtis be violent 1,000 times, but she had never seen anything like this. This wasn't just punishment, it was an erasure. Alexandra was systematically dismantling the man, bone by bone, breath by breath. The Mafia Boss who valued order and trade agreements had been replaced by a creature of pure, possessive instinct. Alexandra grabbed Curtis by the hair, the same way he had grabbed Lynn, and forced his head back. She looked into his fading eyes with a gaze that promised him that death would be the easiest part of his night. "She is not yours," Alexandra hissed, her face inches from his. "She was never yours, she is a part of my soul and you dared to try and tear it out." She threw him to the floor like a piece of discarded trash. Curtis lay in a heap, his breathing shallow and irregular, his body broken beyond repair. Alexandra stood over him, her chest heaving, her silk blouse torn at the shoulder, her hair disheveled. She looked down at her hands, which were covered in his blood, and for a moment she looked confused, as if she were waking up from a dream. She turned toward Lynn. The primal rage was still there, flickering in the depths of her ice-blue eyes, but as she looked at the terrified, wide-eyed girl, something softened. The monster receded, pulling back into the shadows of her soul, leaving behind the woman who had caught Lynn in the rain. Alexandra walked toward her, her steps heavy. She stopped a foot away, her breath still coming in jagged bursts. She reached out, her hand trembling not from fear, but from the sheer volume of the adrenaline still surging through her veins. She tucked a stray lock of Lynn's chestnut hair back into place, her touch so light it was almost a ghost of a gesture. "I'm sorry you had to see that," Alexandra said, her voice returning to its low, rasping cadence, though it was hollowed out by the aftermath of her rage. "I told you I was not nice. I told you I was a different kind of monster." Lynn looked at the blood on Alexandra's hands, then up at the face of the woman who had just destroyed her past. She didn't feel the urge to run. She didn't feel the dizzying need to faint. Instead, she reached out and took Alexandra's hand, her small, pale fingers closing over the blood-stained leather of the glove. "I know," Lynn whispered, her voice steady for the first time in her life, "but you're my monster now." The warehouse was silent once more, but the air had changed. The shadows were no longer places to hide. They were extensions of the power that now surrounded Lynn Dawson. Alexandra closed her eyes for a brief second, leaning her forehead against Lynn's, the two of them standing in the center of the dark, hollow building. The breach had been closed, and the man who had drawn the map of Lynn's pain had been erased from the world. As the guards moved in to finalize the cleaning, Alexandra led Lynn toward the exit. The city waited outside, cold and indifferent as ever, but for the first time Lynn didn't feel like a ghost walking through it. She felt the weight of the silk on her back, the heat of the woman at her side, and the absolute terrifying safety of a cage that was finally, truly her own. The Mafia Boss had lost control, and in that loss Lynn had finally found her place in the world.